Rick Wakeman definitely overplayed, but he wasn't being pretentious. He was just expressing himself. And maybe somebody should have come along and suggested, Rick, maybe you should not play cathedral organ all the way through this song.
I think the moment that you mentioned cathedral organ, I think that's when you lost the argument, James.
Yeah, fair enough. Hi everyone, it's James here. Welcome to another video, and this evening I'm joined by the illustrious Mr. John Downing, 6-inch pianist 319. Hi John.
Hiya.
So John, do you want to talk us through what the concept is, and then we'll take it from there?
Yeah, so I mentioned in my video just about sweeping statements. We all make them in the VC, sort of music generalizations. And I say I'm as guilty as anybody here, but the examples that I used in my video, just a passing comment, were things such as, AC/DC were rubbish after Bon Scott died. Things like you only need to hear the first 4 Black Sabbath albums. That sort of gubbins, really. Nothing particularly scientific. It's just random statements, and quite often these come from, whether it might be the music press, something we've read, and something we've picked up on, and we just regurgitated that. With regards to the AC/DC comment, I remember a friend's older brother saying that to me when I was about 13 or 14 years old. I was just getting into rock music and mentioned I like AC/DC. I think I've heard a whole lot of Rosie, which is still my favourite AC/DC song. And he just made a flippant comment, oh yeah, well, AC/DC were rubbish after Bon Scott died. And of course, I probably regurgitated that as well at some point as well. And then one day I heard, let's get it out, there you go. One day I heard Back in Black. And realised that this wasn't Bon Scott, this was Brian Johnson, and therefore everything that I'd sort of believed, because this older brother, I'd taken this as the Bible sort of thing, what he said, I realised it was all total tosh. And there you go. So that was it basically. So I think you picked out 5 examples of this as well, haven't you?
Yeah, it's interesting how you say total tosh, because one thing that struck me as I was going through, I mean, I've got 5 here to show, and you've got 5 as well. And I was wondering what you thought of this, but I do wonder sometimes whether in these sweeping statements or generalizations, there is sometimes what you might think of as a kernel of truth in there somewhere, or there's some little microscopic basis. So for example, the AC/DC thing, Brian Johnson has made an awful lot of albums with AC/DC. Bon Scott, bless his heart, he died early. There's only a few Bon Scott albums. So taken as a whole, you could probably make an objective case for the Bon Scott era being better than the Brian Johnson era. There's a greater consistency of records. And I tend to find with all my picks that it's the same thing. It's like, yeah, there is a little bit of truth in there somewhere, but the nature of a generalization is that it takes maybe a little sliver of truth and attempts to broaden it out into a sweeping statement, which is not justifiable. Yeah.
And I'd say that is the case with, say, certainly 3 or 4 of my picks, but there's one which it definitely isn't, which I'll come on to in a bit.
Right.
But obviously that example there, I mean, Back in Black, I mean, that is a great record, obviously it's not Bon Scott, but it's a brilliant record, undeniably, I'd say. So.
Okay, well, I'm gonna go Beatles for my first one. Now, I did think of doing the classic Old as the Hills one. McCartney was the balladeer, John Lennon was the rocker, and I decided not to do that one because I feel like it's sort of been done to death a bit, really. This one is really more to do with McCartney, and it's one that I do hear quite a lot, but it's the old classic chestnut. Paul McCartney was crap after the Beatles. Now, would you agree that this is an idea which it's kind of in circulation, isn't it?
I was actually going to pick this, James, but I figured I'd best leave anything Beatles related to you. So
that's very kind of you. You will often get that viewpoint that McCartney was really talented and amazing right up until the last note of Abbey Road, and then just never did anything again. I mean, I would argue there is a kernel of truth in this, in the sense that, again, a bit like with the Brian Johnson thing, McCartney has done a huge amount of music over the last few decades, much of which is perhaps not great. He's not a perfectionist as such, and he does do a lot of goofing off kind of music. But a cursory listen to this album, if you're an open-minded person who just likes popular music and does not have your head rammed firmly up your arse, you should be able to glean from this that McCartney did not suddenly turn shit in 1970.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't think anybody can deny that, really. I mean, it's as you say, the thing with Paul McCartney is that he's made so much music, and he did make, certainly throughout the 70s, so much music in a short period of time.
Yeah.
That, it wasn't all of the highest quality, but within there, there's some absolutely, real gems in there, which are included on the All the Best album, the greatest hits. And he's made some wonderful music, but there's something about Paul McCartney's image, which I think really is the thing behind that opinion. It's the whole, peace signs and all that sort of stuff, He's almost become like a caricature of himself. And I think that gets in the way of the music a lot of the time. Now, I'm with you there, James. Now, I think I'm probably going to lose all of your viewers now by showing this next record, which is Cut the Crap by The Clash. A very easy statement to make is that this is the band's worst record. And even the band have tried to distance themselves from this record. Obviously, at this point, it was only Joe Strummer and Paul Simonon. Topper Headon and Mick Jones had been fired. So it's a very, obviously it's a different lineup. They've tried to rewrite their history, from the band's point of view now. The real lineup of The Clash, their last album was Combat Rock, and this is an album that's sort of forgotten about. Now, for me, and this is where my sweeping statement comes in, this is not the band's worst album, so, and the reason why I say that is because of this. Now,
okay.
Now, the reason why I say that is that The Clash, for every album, they progressed. Their sound developed, whether it be from their debut, which is a straight punk record, through to London Calling, which is just a wonderful record, a real mixture of styles. You've got that whole dub thing going on with Sandinista, and then Combat Rock is a great pop record. And that progression continues with this album. My issue with this album is that it doesn't really have that progression from their debut. It's more of the same, but a diluted version. The songs aren't as good. It's pretty much straight punk, but just not as good as their debut. So that's my logic there. This, on the other hand, it's very 1985. It's quite close to Big Audio Dynamite and what they were doing, what Mick Jones was doing at that point. He was they were including samples in the music. There's a lot of drum machine on this, which I know a lot of Clash fans don't like. Yeah. But it makes it interesting, and for that reason, that I don't think that sweeping statement that this is their worst album.
Okay, I can't comment on Cut the Crap because I've not actually heard it, would you believe? So I can't actually comment on that one. I have read a really interesting Clash biography, though, in which it stated that the two guys that were brought into the Clash, I'm not sure what their names were, but they met each other years later, or they saw each other in a pub, and they didn't even acknowledge each other. They kind of saw each other sort of across a crowded room, and they were both embarrassed to even sort of talk to each other. It was like, oh shit, there's the other guy that was brought into the Clash along with me, just an astonishing story. And I think it just goes to show, like you say, the way that whole period was just completely swept away, wasn't it?
I've got a bit of a fondness for this record, so maybe check it out.
Cool. Right, okay. Well, we're going to go back into the realms for my second choice, a bit like your Bon Scott one. It's to do with a particular prog rock band from the 1970s, and it is Genesis. And you can probably guess what I'm going to say. It's the old chestnut. The moment Peter Gabriel left Genesis, all the other guys in the band magically transformed from this really kind of interesting progressive outfit into just a bunch of completely bland, sellout, not worth listening to schmucks. This is the extreme view. Now, again, it's the kernel of truth thing again, isn't it? Because with Peter Gabriel, obviously, you had this incredibly distinctive theatrical showman, somebody with a very interesting lyrical angle. He came from that great British tradition of pop songwriting, that sort of surreal, slightly deranged almost, hallucinogenic kind of thing. And he had a definite cohesive vision, which arguably they did lose after he left the band. After The Lamb, he kind of imploded, really. That was as much as he could do with Genesis. And you could argue, they should have just completely folded at this point. But I mean, I discovered Genesis backwards. The first of their albums I listened to was Invisible Touch, which is about as far away from the classic Genesis sound as you can possibly get. But I loved it at the time. I mean, nowadays it wouldn't be my go-to Genesis album, but back in, I think it was 1990, I heard that for the first time. I just loved those sort of longer tracks, things like Domino and Tonight Tonight. They've still got that progressive sound, the Tony Banks thing. yes, by that point, Phil Collins had become a huge pop star and they were angling themselves more towards the commercial side of things. But this idea that they lost their creativity, I mean, this is the first album they did after Gabriel left. I listened to this one a couple of weeks ago and I so enjoyed it. I mean, it's got some classic stuff on it. Virtually every song is fantastic. Tony Banks was often acknowledged as the kind of musical powerhouse behind Genesis. This kind of misnomer, this idea that Peter Gabriel was not just the singer of Genesis, he was the songwriter. That's the illusion which has come to be. Oh yeah, he was a songwriter and he left. And then the guys who were not in any way creative in the band had to step forward and try and write Genesis music. But if you look at the songwriting credits on The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, you'll see Tony Banks's name over and over again.
Yeah.
Mike Rutherford over and over again. Steve Hackett wrote songs. But to say that from the moment Gabriel left, they were just not worth listening to, I just think is totally wide of the mark.
I think a lot of that opinion comes from Phil Collins' image.
Yeah.
You know, certainly when you get into the 1980s, he was everywhere, wasn't he? You know, so obviously you got the Genesis releases, but also all those solo records. And he just seemed to be everywhere. I mean, something like You Can't Hurry Love was the #1 single over here. I mean, I can just imagine if you're a Genesis fan in 1981 or 82 when that song came out, and that song's everywhere, and, you know, this is a singer in your favourite band, you know, that's gonna affect your opinion, isn't it? You know, so yeah. Invisible Touch is a great album. It's a great, you know, it's that pop rock sound, isn't it? Very mid-80s. But the songs are strong. I mean, I saw Genesis play last year, and all the singles off that album, they're still playing live, you know, and that's what the fans want to hear. They're great songs. So, yeah, I don't really buy into that opinion either, you know, so.
Cool.
Right, okay. Right, so I played in a band for about 10 years, which had a female drummer, okay? And one thing that I used to hear quite regularly from blokes was that women or girls can't play the drums. And it's something, it's, you know, it's that sort of misogynist bullshit, but it's something to do with, they're quite happy for women to play guitars or to sing or keyboards, but there's something about the physicality of playing the drums, which, you know, generates that sort of opinion. And it's utter rubbish, of course, you know. So I've got a few albums here. So, for example, Meg White. I know that, you know, her drumming style isn't necessarily technical, but it perfectly suits the music. You know, I watched their performance at Glastonbury from, I don't know, mid-2000s, something like that. And the sound, the overall sound is just about, as much about her drumming as it is Jack White's songs and his guitar playing and his performance. Yeah, absolutely wonderful. She's brilliant at what she does. The same goes for Mo Tucker with the Velvets. And if you want to see somebody who is technically incredible,
I know what's coming. Yeah,
there we go, Sheila E. You know, so check out any of those Prince performances from sort of the Sign of the Times or Love Sex era. She is absolutely, you know, a wonderful musician. She worked with Prince throughout his lifetime. And yeah, but actually one more, I should show this as well. So Honey Lantry in the Honeycombs in the mid-60s. This is a Joe Meek production. They had a big #1 hit in the UK. I think it was #1 with Have I the Right, a great song. This is the album that came after that, but there she is front and centre, female drummer. So there you go. But yeah, I heard that a lot when I was playing. I played in a band for 10 years with a drummer, and she didn't hit the drums hard, you know. But as you well know, James, as a drummer yourself, you don't need to do that to be able to play the drums. You've got to play the instrument. You know, it's not just a case of hitting them. But yeah, that was lost on a lot of people, and that's something that I heard a lot. That massive generalisation, and hopefully she put them in their place when they heard her play. So yeah.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I don't think I've ever heard that one, but I can definitely see how some people could arrive at that kind of. I think, as you say, it's this misguided idea that there's some kind of necessity for heavy, masculine power. You know, that's a kind of bludgeoning thing. Which, even if that was true, that still wouldn't hold, because there's no reason why a woman shouldn't be like that behind the drums anyway. But, you know, like you say, the trick to good drumming is not necessarily just to hammer them as hard as you can. I mean, there's more to it than that, you know. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not a big White Stripes fan, but I do really like Meg White's drumming. She's very elemental. It's just no frills, you know. And to play like that and to sustain it over the course of a gig, you know, whatever, like an hour. It's not easy, you know.
No, she got that raw energy, and which
Yeah.
really suits the music. You know, I love the way she plays. As I say, you know, it's not technical,
No.
but it you know, it works perfectly with that sound. I think she's as much as a part of that sound as Jack White and his songs.
Good, excellent. This is one this is old as the hills, and as soon as I say it, you'll be like, yeah, okay. And it's to do with Bob Dylan. So it's the classic Bob Dylan can't sing.
I mean, that's basically what my wife says about Bob Dylan.
Ah, right.
You know,
Oh, good. Oh, good.
She
okay.
likes his songs, but she can't stand him singing them.
Yeah.
And
Well,
sorry, carry on.
no. I was just going to say that you can differentiate, can't you, between saying I can't stand Bob Dylan's voice, which is completely fair enough, because you can say that about anybody. I mean, I could say that about Pavarotti. I mean, who clearly can sing. I don't like his voice, but he can sing. So I don't mind people saying I don't like Dylan's voice, but it's that jump from saying I don't like it to saying he can't do it. He can't sing.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the first album I heard by Dylan. And
right. Okay.
I've got to be honest. I mean, I was fortunate in the sense that it was one of his better efforts, and it's got that great production by Daniel Lanois, who I must admit he knew how to produce Bob's voice. He was able to do things with it, and you know, put a bit of effects on it here and there. But essentially, it's Bob. You know, it's Bob being Bob. I mean, there's no auto tuning. There's no attempt to actually disguise the voice. It's maybe enhanced a little bit. But it never occurred to me, because I knew nothing about Bob Dylan when I heard this, absolutely nothing at all. You know, I think I was about 18 or 19 when I heard it. So I knew nothing about him. I never read anything about him. I didn't know that there was this issue with his voice, and it just never occurred to me. I played the album, I listened to it, and not once did I think, oh, this guy can't sing. It's like, it just never entered my mind. I mean, clearly he's got a very distinctive voice, very, very, you know, he's got his own identity. He's not technically accomplished. He's had no training. I mean, one interesting thing about Dylan is the fact that he didn't just have one voice. He had lots of different voices. If you go through his career, if you hear him singing on Blonde, it's nothing like John Wesley Harding. And then he changes again, going into Nashville Skyline.
Well, that's what I was going to say, actually. What you mentioned there, sorry to interrupt, when you say about Bob Dylan and you know, whether he can sing or not, I always point people to Nashville Skyline.
Yeah.
Because at that point he gave up cigarettes, he gave up smoking, and his voice is a lot purer. It's you know, it's a beautiful vocal on that album, and it really does stand out in amongst his entire catalogue. It's a unique sound that he had at that particular moment in time. But you can't. I don't think anybody could argue the fact that, you know, he definitely can sing on that record. It's just his delivery later on. You know, it doesn't necessarily sit right with everybody. You know, as is the case with my wife. But there you go.
I think I mean, it's all part and parcel of his provocative nature, isn't it? He was not out to make a pleasing, nice sound that everybody could agree was a nice sound and say, oh yeah, I love Bob Dylan, he's a great singer. That's not what his mission statement was. He was out to provoke, he was out to annoy even, you know. If you take the famous Judas moment, it wasn't just his voice, it was everything about him back in the 60s, his lyrics, just his approach, just the way he changes his songs all the time to annoy his fans. And, you know, there's so many things about Dylan which make him what he is. And one of those is the fact that he does not have a conventionally pleasing voice. But I think if you listen to Nashville Skyline, that should put paid forever to this idea that he couldn't sing. It's more that he could sing, but he wasn't really interested in spending 40 years singing like he does on Nashville Skyline. I love that. It's like just a quick glimpse of like, oh, you know, I could sing like this if I wanted to, but I'm not going to.
Well, I agree totally, James, but with one caveat.
Okay.
And that is the recordings that he made over the last sort of 10 years of the Great American Songbook.
Okay.
I cannot stand those records, and that is because of his voice.
Yeah.
And it's just from the point of view, if I want to hear those songs, I listen to Frank Sinatra sing them rather than Bob Dylan. You know, Bob Dylan singing his own songs, absolutely perfect. You know, that is how that music should be heard. But I don't necessarily need to hear the Great American Songbook sung by Bob Dylan. Yeah. Right. Okay.
Right.
On to my next one. Right. So this basically came from a conversation that I had just last week in a record shop with a record shop owner, and it was a great little shop, a real mixture of stuff. And he basically said, I stock everything apart from dance music, anything like that, because I don't understand it. He said, for me, music is made by real musicians playing real instruments. Okay, and you know that was his stance. It's his shop, so that's what he stopped. He stopped the music that he liked. But that is something I've heard quite a lot over the years. I used to, again, that same band that I played in, the guitarist was very much like that. Anything outside of a traditional band, a traditional rock sound, he couldn't get his head around. And it got me thinking about this album. And this is just an example. This is the Avalanches with Since I Left You. It came out in 2000, and this is an interesting album because it's entirely made up of samples. There's no new music recorded on here at all. I think there's something like over 2,000 samples which have been used to put together, which is a fantastic pop album. It's not, you know, it's not strange. It's not avant-garde. This is a pop record which has been made up of other people's music, just snippets from here and there, and putting it together to create something new. And I do find that totally fascinating. But you know, I can understand the chap I was speaking to. I can understand his point of view. He knows what he likes. You know, it's what he understands. He can understand a band of, you know, 2 guitars, a keyboard, a bass player, and a drummer. You know, he can understand that sound. So somebody putting together something different using other people's music and snippets from one thing and something else from something else, you know, yeah, he couldn't get his head round. But an interesting viewpoint. But that's the example that I would use. You know, to show the flip side of that coin.
Yeah, years ago I was working at the civil service and I had a desk job, and it was one of those desks where you were directly in front of somebody. So they had their screen there and I had my screen, talking to each other over the top of the monitors. So I would talk to this guy quite a lot, and he had the same attitude. And one day he said the one thing which totally nailed it. And because we were talking about synths and sequencers and everything, because I had a few friends who made music in that way. And he said to me, "Isn't it cheating though?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Well, it's sort of getting the machines to do it for you, isn't it? It's because it's the machines making the music. It's like, you know, people don't stop to consider. It's just like, oh, yeah, no, it has to be guitars, bass and drums, or it can't be music." Thinking about the people who booed and hissed at Suicide when they came to the UK, and they played, you know, for the punks. Yeah. And the punk audience, you know, meant to be this kind of iconoclastic, open-minded audience who were into the idea of new ways of expression. And these 2 guys come on with these keyboards and start playing this strange electronic music, and they got bottled.
It's interesting because I suppose we're all guilty of that to some extent, because we all have our comfort zone, don't we? And it doesn't matter if you consider yourself as being a punk, you know, and you think, you know, oh, well, I'm quite, you know, quite open-minded with what I'm looking at. But if it doesn't fall into that mold, then sometimes it is quite difficult to understand something which is outside of that, you know. But yeah, I mean, so this chap that I was speaking to, you know, he talked, you know, we spoke for quite a period of time, and he was talking about referencing all different types of music, but it was just this one area he had a real blind spot. And I just found it fascinating, the fact that, you know, and he had no desire to you know, to explore it. You know, a guy in his mid-60s, he's, you know, he's quite happy as he was. And he said, you know, I understand that people like it. I understand, you know, that it's popular. And I understand the issue here is me, but I've got no desire to try and understand music which isn't made in this, this formula. So
I'm going to do this one, but I must admit it's not something I hear a great deal of on the VC, but it's something which I think historically has been there in the culture of music fans and, you know, whatever, you know, music aficionados. And it's just the old one: white men can't sing the blues, or white musicians can't play the blues. Now, I think even if you don't necessarily subscribe to that as an explicit ethos or a thing that you would say, I think there's a general kind of prejudice maybe that you find against white blues musicians or white musicians who play blues derived music that you don't really find when you consider the black guy. So I mean, a classic case is Eric Clapton. Eric Clapton's just a white guy that stole BB's music, so it's kind of okay to slag him off. Now the problem with this is that, again, if you go back to the grain of truth thing, you have to consider that, you know, white people made a huge amount of money out of the blues, and the black guys that originated it made diddly squat.
Nothing. Yeah.
So you've got to bring that political thing into it and say, yeah, this is the other way of looking at it. You've got these black guys, or, you know, and women, black singers, making this music, originating the music. And then you had the white guys who came afterwards, the British invasion, or whatever you want to call it, work that caveat into it. I'm not sure if it's true, this idea that white people can't play the blues. I think if you look at someone like Peter Green from the original Fleetwood Mac, and to be honest with you, I mean, Clapton as well. I mean, people slag off Clapton's playing and say, oh, it doesn't contain any genuine emotion. It's almost like he's just learned all the blues scales or the blues figures and he stitched them together in such a way that he can sort of reel them off in a kind of calculated way. But I'm not even sure that's true. I think on Clapton's best music, there is a genuine blues sensibility coming through. Certainly in Peter Green's playing, you definitely hear this deeply kind of mournful, because the guy had psychological problems, a definite heaviness in the music, which you could say, yeah, that is kind of comparable to some of the stuff that you'd hear in classic blues music.
Yeah. No, I mean, Peter Green, an incredible guitarist. I mean, when you started talking about, obviously, white blues musicians, that's the first name that springs to mind. He was just a wonderful guitar player. Eric Clapton, I don't really have an issue with it. It's just the fact that as time has gone off, his music has become more and more bland. But he just seems to have gone down this path where it is just straight blues all the time. And it just becomes monotonous and a bit boring. It's not to do with the quality of his playing. It's just the fact there's no variation for me. That's my issue with Eric Clapton.
Yeah, I mean, you hear that sort of sameness coming through in the black artists too. I mean, if you listen to like a modern album by Buddy Guy, say, I mean, you'll get 12 songs which are all the same chords and they've all got the same notes in them. So you can't really escape from that. I mean, there's even an argument to be made for some of the white guys who took it on board, maybe threw in their own chord progressions and messed it up a little bit and experimented a little bit. I mean, John Peel always said in the 60s, he openly said he preferred Eric Clapton to B.B. King. And he said at the time, it seemed quite a shocking thing to admit. And his reasoning for that, it was quite straightforward. You know, John Peel was always a fan of the new or stuff that was more recent. And to him, Clapton was like an exciting new thing, whereas B.B. King, even though B.B. King was great, B.B. King was, you know, he was the old guard, and here's Clapton, you know, doing something new with it. So there's a different perspective.
Now, I just want to mention a bit of reggae here, and British reggae. So when it comes to British reggae, I think the band that people automatically think of are UB40. I hear a lot of people talking about UB40, and it's almost like they speak about them with a caveat. You know, I like their first two. I like their first two records. I like early UB40, and I understand that because they were quite cool at that point. So albums like Signing Off and Present Arms, it's almost okay to say that you like those records. But then a couple of years later, they made a covers album called Labour of Love. And Red Red Wine was a massive hit all over the world. Arguably, after Bob Marley and the Wailers, UB40 are probably the most successful reggae bands, you know, in history from a commercial point of view. So after they become really big and really commercial, and this is often the case with any band, fans like their music before they make it. You know, we're quite fickle like that. We want everybody to hear our favourite band's music, but the point when everybody does hear it and likes it, that's when we all step back and say, oh, no thanks, that's not for me anymore. And UB40 are a perfect example of that, because Red Red Wine was everywhere. It's a massive hit worldwide. And then you've got a period then where they are bona fide pop stars at that point then. They're still making reggae music, and people step away from these records. They made some great music. So whether that be the album Jeffrey Morgan, get it all the way around, Bag of Rhythm, or Rat in My Kitchen. Now, this is a big one for me. This came out in 1986. And the reason why I mention this is because Astro in UB40, he would certainly be the first artist that I heard singing in that DJ reggae style. You know, so he is the first person that I heard toasting on a record. And that would be the same, I think, for many people. Because they were so big and they were so commercially successful, you then had this situation where you heard this style of DJ reggae music, a very Jamaican sound, albeit, you know, obviously the band from Birmingham, you know, brought to the masses, you know, and, you know, so that's really important. People forget about that. I think they played a massive part in promoting reggae music to the whole world, really, you know, obviously after Bob Marley, whatever. But yeah, a really important band, and a really important band in the history of British music as well, British pop music. So I would urge people to check out those mid-80s albums and not just listen to the first two UB40 records.
Certainly, this idea of the first couple of albums being the ones. I mean, the band that sprung to mind when you were talking then, and I don't know much about this band either, and I don't think they're comparable really, but Simple Minds would be another one where people tend to go, oh yeah, early Simple Minds, don't go for the
Yeah.
big stadium rock, Simple Minds. It's almost like, yeah, what, because there's too many people that liked it kind of thing, you know. Pink Floyd are another one. You get so many people, usually old farts from the 60s who go, oh, after Syd Barrett left, after the first couple of albums, there was no more Pink Floyd for me. There's so many people who say that, and I'm sure there's other bands as well.
We're musical snobs, really, aren't we? That's basically
Yeah.
what it is. We like to find something and think that it's ours. It's our thing, you know, and we want people to hear it. But the moment when they get too big, we often step away. We often step away from them, or we just treasure that little pocket of music which we can relate to and we think is ours, we consider ours, and then, you know, everything after that we turn our back on, which is incredibly unfair and in most cases unwarranted, but hey ho.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm going to go with my last one now, and this is one which hopefully we should be able to talk about. This is Tales from Topographic Oceans by Yes. It's such a vast album. It's only a double album, but it seems like a triple. You know, when you get like halfway through side 3, you start thinking, is this a double, or have I been listening to this record like for the last 3 days, you know? It's this idea that progressive rock was pretentious. Now, I know this has come up before. This is not any kind of great original idea. This has been talked about before. Prog rock, pretentious prog rock. The prog rockers were pretentious, etc., etc. And again, you know, going back to the kernel of truth, this album was inspired by a footnote in a quite a prominent Eastern text. It was the autobiography of a yogi, I think, which I've got on the shelf over there somewhere. It was just a footnote, and John Anderson read it in the dressing room of a hotel somewhere, and he and Steve Howe then proceeded to write this double album. You know, the accusation therefore was that John Anderson was pretending to know more than he did about this Eastern tradition. In fact, he just got it from a footnote, and they kind of spun it out into this epic, you know. I know where it comes from. It's this idea that rock music in its first elemental state, it was meant to be 3 chords and just get the girls dancing, and then Bob Dylan came along and suggested maybe you could sing about something interesting, have some politics in there maybe. And then the Beatles came along and said, why don't we sort of put a few interesting chords into it and maybe a few backward tape loops. But then all of a sudden it's prog rock, and it's like, oh, no, now it's pretentious. It's like, okay, they were just following that trajectory. They were just going, well, this thing, it's been evolving. It's going to carry on evolving. We might as well just keep thinking of ways of making it interesting. I don't think necessarily they were being pretentious.
I mean, yes, I mean, I think I'm probably guilty of saying that as well, James, to be honest with you. You know, just because, I don't know, it's I suppose from a personal point of view, I don't necessarily like music to be overly thought about. You know, for me, rhythm and blues, soul music, just good time music, rock and roll, that's what really hits me. Something like prog music. Now, there are some prog albums that I really like, you know, but on the whole, it does feel too overblown, and that's. But the flip side of this is, and this is the thing that people miss with prog, is that arguably without prog you wouldn't have punk, because, you know, punk was rebelling against something, and that's what it is rebelling against, you know. So you do need these extremes to generate, you know, something new, and perhaps the early part of prog, you know, as you say, going from the Beatles into the early 70s thing. You know, I don't mind that, but it's when you get to the mid-70s, and as you say, that's an example there of a record which I've never heard, but my immediate perception is that it's a bit too overly thought out.
Yeah, well, I think you've got to differentiate the concept of bloated and pretentious, I think. I think, you know, music can be bloated, but you could still say, yeah, but they weren't pretending. They weren't trying to put a facade up or say, I think it's because they were great musicians. I mean, if you were a crap musician and you were trying to make out that you could play all this technical stuff, maybe then you could say it was pretentious. And yes, I mean, they were just great musicians. They had the chops, they had the technique. Why would they go into a studio and try and make a sort of punk album with 3 chords?
Yeah.
It's just, that wouldn't be them being true to themselves. I mean,
no.
So yeah, Rick Wakeman definitely overplayed, but he wasn't being pretentious. He was just expressing himself. And maybe somebody should have come along and suggested, Rick, maybe you should not play cathedral organ all the way through this song. You know, like in on the album Going for the One, side 1 of that record, he plays the cathedral organ pretty much all the way through the album. I mean, did nobody, you know, in the mixing session, did nobody say, why don't we just move Rick's faders down at least for like 5 minutes? Just get rid of this cathedral organ, which is playing all the way through, you know, but not pretentious necessarily.
No.
Although he was playing a cathedral organ, so maybe he was being bloody pretentious. I don't know. Anyway, it's quite a fun one to think about.
I think the moment that you mentioned cathedral organ, I think that's when you lost the argument.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah,
but no,
I'll get my coat.
Right. Okay. So very simple one for me.
Yep.
Stevie Wonder is one of my favourite artists. I love his music. I love all his music. I'm honest with you. But there's been this perception, which is mainly been generated by the music press over the years. They really single out that period from 1971 through to 76, where he made this incredible run of albums, from Music in My Mind,
yeah,
Talking Book, Inner Visions, Fulfills his first finale, finishing it off with the absolutely wonderful Songs in the Key of Life. And quite rightly so, you know, everybody focuses on that run of records, but for me, that's oversimplifying the situation. So obviously he signed to Motown just as a kid, and I think throughout the 1960s, the figures are that he made something like $30 million from Motown, and was paid $1 million, which of course $1 million is a lot of money, certainly for, you know, the age that he was. You know, he was a teenager by the time you know, at the end of that period. But still, comparatively, 30 million quid to the 1 million that is paid wasn't right. But so then when he renegotiated his contract, he basically said, okay, I want creative freedom. That's what he wanted. He obviously got a better royalty rate, but his main thing was he wanted creative freedom. And that then started with this album. This is Where I'm Coming From, which came out in 1969, did it? I think it was 69.
I've not heard that one.
Yeah, I mean, and this is the album that came out before Music in My Mind. So this includes stuff like Never Dreamed You'd Leave in Summer, If You Really Love Me, an absolutely incredible song, Do Yourself a Favour. It's a brilliant record, but this is clearly a step up from what he was doing as a kid. And this is almost the bridge between his 60s, you know, 60s Stevie as a child star for Motown. This is the bridge that gets him to that incredible run of records. So, you know, the clear exceptional run of albums there runs from Music in My Mind through to Songs in the Key of Life, but it doesn't take into account what he did either side of that. Music journalists would have you believe that after Songs in the Key of Life, he then went crap. He didn't record anything good again. And I know that we've spoken about the book Lost in Music before. You sent me a copy of it by Giles Smith, is it?
Yeah.
And he talks, there's a great chapter in that book where he talks about discovering Songs in the Key of Life and loving that record, and then, you know, continuing buying after that new Stevie Wonder records, and just always being disappointed because it never lived up to that. And just because those records didn't live up to Songs in the Key of Life, I mean, this is one of the greatest albums ever made. You know, it's like saying that the Wings records didn't live up to Sergeant Pepper or Revolver or Rubber Soul. You know, these are some of the greatest records ever made. You know, to think that he's going to do it every time is is ridiculous, really. But following that run of records, he obviously recorded the Life of Plants album, which was a soundtrack to a documentary. So I'll skip over that because it's not a genuine album. But this was the album that he put out, I think, in 1980, and this was everywhere. You know, I'm sure you've seen this sleeve in charity shops and record shops, you know, many times. And this is almost a situation where it was almost too poppy, it was too commercial. The music was everywhere, as we described with Phil Collins or whatever else, and, you know, people turn their back on it. This is a great record. It's a brilliant record. So when you're thinking about those 5 records, think about the album that started it, Where I'm Coming From, and think about the album that ended that, you know, that decade as well, with the Hotter Than July. This is an exceptional Stevie Wonder record. Yeah. And don't just listen to the music journalists.
I think it's that thing, isn't it, where these artists like Stevie Wonder, Elton John, there's a few others as well, something about the 1970s. They all had a really great 1970s. And unfortunately, I think, well, maybe it's come round again now, because I don't know how many young people listen to music journalists anymore, because we now live in the age of Spotify, where you can basically, if you decide that you like Stevie Wonder, I could imagine a young person just, you know, going onto Spotify and just making a random playlist and just hearing songs from all through his without any particular understanding of, like, oh, this comes from his classic period, or this comes from the later, not very good 80s period. So, you know, maybe that will start to change, or perhaps it's started to change already. I don't know. Thanks for sticking with us, folks, on this one. So let us know in the comments below if you've got any ideas for sweeping statements which can't be supported by any empirical evidence, which gets trotted out. I must admit, I've still got a few in my back pocket, John, so we could maybe do a part 2 at some point.
There you go.
Yeah, thanks for joining me for this one. Really enjoyable.
Brilliant. No, thanks for having me. It's been great fun.
Good stuff. All right, folks, we shall see you soon. Take care. Bye. You're not going to say bye, John?
No.